Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special interview I have today. So, I was gifted this lovely little book here. This is Melodies of Life, a Final Fantasy IX retrospective and analysis, and it is written by Jamie L. Cruz, who happens to be my lovely guest today. Jamie, how are you doing, sir?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for being on my little show here. So it's funny, Jamie and I are both Final Fantasy fans, and we actually met online when we were playing the Final Fantasy trading card game. We were just random opponents, and we kind of bantered back and forth as we were playing, and, we kind of got to liking each other, and I was like, hey, we should be friends after this, and, let's play some more games, so we did that. And I don't remember how this book came up, but I don't remember. Jamie, you must have mentioned it at some point, and I was like, oh, well, I love that. I love all the Final Fantasy games, so let's see it. And we kind of got to this idea that, like, ooh, we should, I should read it, and then we can have a little talk about it. So, full disclosure, Jamie did provide me with this copy, so he did send this to me as a gift. Reading over it, it's a really enjoyable book. It's a very quick read. Let's get to talking about this book. So first things first, Melodies of Life. If you hadn't played Final Fantasy IX, would you recommend that they read this book, or do you think, they really should read it to get the most out of it?
I'll stick to my guns, as I say at the beginning of the book. If you haven't played Final Fantasy IX and you do like the Final Fantasy games, you absolutely should play it and experience it for yourself, because it's like nothing else. But one of the things that I learned through joining the Final Fantasy community, and specifically the Final Fantasy IX groups, was that there are quite a lot of people out there who have this intense love for the characters and all the elements in the game without actually having played it, which intrigued me, because I've never really come across that kind of investment in anything that hasn't directly been experienced. And I think that kind of just speaks for the quality of all the little parts that make up this game. So for people like that, middle grade between never having played a Final Fantasy and not having played this one, yeah, for them, this is a great way. If you don't have the 40, 50, 60 hours to sink into this game, it's a good way to catch up and have the plot summarized, as well as sort of analyzing the characters that you're already somewhat familiar with. I've had a couple of people get back to me who haven't played the game that have read the book anyway, and they found it a fun experience, just the way that the plot summary at the beginning of the book goes over everything with a sort of commentative nature, gives them a good enough idea that they were satisfied they'd had the experience.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
I love the brush you paint the summary with, because, I love 9, but even I, as much, and I've played that game maybe 3 or 4 times before, but even I, it's been years and years since I've played it, so it was a nice reminder, and I think you do a really good job with the plot summary of, you use a broad enough brush that, you're not bogged down into the, here's the thing you do, and then you take 2 steps forward and you do this thing, but then you also have enough detail and character there that we do understand not just the basic plot, but also like kind of what the character motivations are throughout each scene in the plot, which is nice. So yeah, I think you wove that really well. So if for someone who does love Final Fantasy IX, like myself, like let's say somebody loves 9, they've never heard of this book, why should they read this book? What are they going to get out of this book?
The people that really love 9 and have played it through a few times, I mean, it's with them particularly. I had them in mind when I was writing this, because first and foremost, it's a resource that didn't exist. I looked, and you can find articles that people have written online about specific things, but there wasn't a compendium as such. That summarizes the game and gives you a little extra, gives interpretations, that sort of thing. And that was, a big part of the genesis of the idea to write this book, because I wanted it to exist, and I thought, well, it doesn't, so I'm going to write it. And it was a lot of fun. If you love something, hearing someone else talk about their love for it, then demonstrating their understanding and sort of giving out some hopefully new ideas about, this game that's been around for 20 years is both refreshing, and it also it kicks you right in the nostalgia. It's just fun, if not entertaining and informative.
Awesome. No, that's fantastic. So this cover art here we have, looks like we've got Vivi and Steiner and Zidane and Garnet all in the background, and it looks like they're in a meadow or a field of some sort. Again, it's been a minute since I've played the game. Remind me, is this a scene from the game, or is this something you came up with? What made you pick this for the cover art?
Yes, so a little backstory on that. I created this book entirely myself, so that includes the cover design, the interior formatting, and everything.
You drew this?
But one of the things... no.
Okay.
No, I created that image from a stock photo, which is the background you see of the field, and then on the back you'll see a little windmill.
Yes, that must be the village of Dali.
Yes, obviously the Dali windmill has have vertical sails rather than horizontal ones, but horizontal sails instead of vertical ones. But the reason I created this was because I had a nightmare with getting an artist involved. A couple fell through for me. The last one really at the last minute, through really no fault of their own, just life got in the way. And I was looking at a choice whether to delay things. I didn't even know how long it would be before I got someone who could, go through the concept document with me and produce something, and hopefully it would be okay and, wouldn't demand a lot of money. So I ended up creating this on my own, just from creating silhouettes so I didn't breach copyright. And sort of creating this image that, as you kind of pointed out, like it's got that Dali feel to it, like the sort of arrival at Dali at twilight. It's a lot more complicated than I originally wanted it to be. My original concept design was just with the Final Fantasy IX crystal on the front, just simple, clean.
Yeah. I'm gonna guess. I've heard
it would have been
you
nice.
I've talked about this before, but I've heard like Square is really like uptight about using any of their images or artwork, so I'm sure they gave you crap about that.
Yeah, they've got a stock letter as such for that sort of thing. Do not use our logos. Do not use any part of the imagery around our logos. Do not use our characters. Don't even bother asking. It's a hard no.
Yeah.
So this cover was me trying to circumvent all these different issues with putting the book out, and this seems to have hit the mark. It's expressive enough without it does say Final Fantasy IX without explicitly using any of their materials.
No, if I hadn't seen the title, like just looking at that picture, I would say, oh, that looks like Final Fantasy IX. The silhouettes really stick out in that. So this book is about 200 pages long, give or take. I was able to read through it in, maybe it took about 5 hours. It was a very quick read, and again, it's a subject matter I like, so I was very into it. About how long do you think it took you to write?
So I used NaNoWriMo to write this, which is National Novel Writers Month, which happens every November, and the aim of which is to write 50,000 words in 30 days. Funnily enough, this book is, I think, it's either just under or just over 50,000 words in the final cut, and it took me just over that month period to write. So say about 6 weeks, and then the same again for editing, formatting, cover design, all of that. But I've been compiling notes for a couple of years for this Final Fantasy IX idea that I didn't really understand what it would become. So I was sort of prepped for it, but the writing itself was very, very quick.
Oh, that's awesome. So it sounds like you blazed through it. What was the easiest part of the book to write for you?
I've got to say the summary. One, because I'm very familiar. I've played with it more times. I've played the game through more times than I care to admit. Although I think I do in the book. But it was something that I did in blocks. I didn't write it all through in one go. I would write a little bit of the summary, and then I would move on to the different sections I was writing. And whenever I reached a natural end, or I got a little bit stuck, wasn't sure how to discuss something further or how to fit in a certain subject, I'd go back to the summary and write a little more. Which was helped by the fact that I was sort of playing the game alongside, so I had a nice refresher going.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, usually when I would like write in college and such, I would always start with something and then write all the way through. So that's interesting. You kind of jump back as you needed it to. Did you pull like a summary off of like the Final Fantasy wiki page, or did you actually just compile it yourself as you played through the game?
I compiled it myself. I really didn't want a crib sheet because
sure. That's fair.
I think this was my expression and my interpretation of the game, and I didn't want to sort of affect that by having, outside source and be like, oh, this paragraph just neatly sums that up. I'll have that.
Right.
Because, when you start doing that, you lose your voice that you're expressing yourself through, and the reader can tell.
Yes.
So I wanted something consistent and something that was entirely me.
If you'd asked me to guess, I would have guessed you wrote it, because I've read, some of those wikis before, and again, they're usually a much broader brush of just like, here are the main plot points you need to know, and because of the way you talked about the characters, like you said, your voice obviously rang through that. So well done.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if that was the easiest part for you to write, what was the hardest part for you to write?
I'd say it would probably be the section on Kuja, specifically relating to Nietzsche's nihilism.
Yeah.
And applying that to Final Fantasy IX, specifically the antagonist.
Yeah, that's
And
something I would have never thought about. And when you got into that section, I was like, whoa, I know of Nietzsche, but I've never really studied his philosophy or anything, and I know of nihilism. So when you said that, you made a really interesting comparison, between that and Kuja and Garland and, Terra. Go ahead, sorry.
No, it's fine. And that's kind of the understanding I was playing on when I was writing it. Was there's a lot of people have a rudimentary knowledge, or at least they know the phrase "God is dead." But for the people that have a little bit more background in philosophy, specifically, know a little bit more about Nietzsche, they'll probably understand that this is quite a rudimentary analysis. And the reason for that is it's using that common knowledge to look at just one aspect, And the hard part for me was actually taking a step back and being, I had these doubts, like, you don't mention essentialism. You can flip this whole argument by just bringing that up and saying, actually, what if they're, what about stripping away all the lies and all the things that don't make an authentic sense of self? What about that? And like, no, that's a whole other thing. And that requires, I spent like a page or two going over concepts of decadence and things like that, and Nietzsche's view of religion and society in general and morality, and that really had to be enough to sort of start applying it to different places, because otherwise I'll be writing a whole book with like just called FF9, the nihilist interpretation,
right.
And that's not what I set out to do. So It was hard just taking a step back and saying this is enough. And that's kind of what the book's about. It's supposed to make you think and apply some ideas, but fundamentally my goal would be for you or whoever to read it and come away with some of your own ideas as well.
So you mentioned it being your own interpretation. Obviously you used the game and the game script for reference. Did you have any other sources you really drew from? I think you mentioned the Ultimanias at one point in the book, the creator interviews, and maybe they gave more insight to this, because I only know basically what the game itself has told me. I've never done research beyond that.
Yeah. So as you say, I used the Ultimanias. The original Ultimania, I believe, is only in Japanese. We got a copy over here as an archive grouped together with, Volume 2 is Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9, which is a more condensed version. We don't have as much, and you have to really sort of take a dive to get translations of the original source. Stuff like the inside stories about the song Not Alone or You're Not Alone, depending on where you got the song from. That kind of interview information is included in those sources. So that sort of thing is stuff that I reference a little bit in the book. But largely it's from my own experience and just, sort of gestating and considering how I think of all the different elements that make up Final Fantasy IX, and just sort of using interview sources as a jumping off point to sort of start a conversation.
So 9 is, in my opinion, a very great Final Fantasy. I've played over 28 Final Fantasies, if you count like spin-offs and mobile titles and all that. But I think 9 might be in my top 5. I have my list written out somewhere. I'd have to go check it. But I know 9 is very high up there. It's always been one of my favorites. But what other Final Fantasies do you like? And in particular, I guess, if you could do this book again, if you were to write another book, and it had to be on another Final Fantasy, what other Final Fantasy would you pick?
The writing fatigue hasn't quite worn off that I'm engaged enough to be like, oh, I'm definitely into this. No, I've considered it, and although it's still a Square Enix property, but not a Final Fantasy, I've already started collecting some notes for a larger work on Kingdom Hearts. The scale difference is going to be massive, so I'm not going to talk too much about that. But in terms of doing another book this sort of size, so it's an easy read, easy to digest, but lots of little ideas packed into it, I'd probably choose Final Fantasy 10 or 15. Probably the former.
Yeah, 10 is great.
There's
10's
a lot
actually my personal favorite, so if you ever did, I'd be there day one buying a copy of it.
Well, I'll keep that in mind, and we can do another interview when that comes around.
Well, and 9, I believe Hironobu Sakaguchi, who is basically the creator of Final Fantasy, has always said that 9 is his personal favorite. And, it was interesting reading this, how much you were able to extract and interpret from this as a PlayStation game. This came out in 1999 or 2000? I think 2000 in the States for sure. And, obviously it's an RPG, so it's much lengthier than your average game. but still, to be able to pull that much character and detail out of it was very enjoyable. And you reminded me of parts I'd forgotten about 9, such as when Zidane and Garnet are out on the boat when they're in Maiden Sari, and just how great that scene was. And, it's just a scene about character. It doesn't, move the plot, but it's just there to help these two characters develop their relationship, the romantic relationship, which for me is all hi, I love. Whereas something like Final Fantasy 15 even, that's a really new, modern, super fancy polished game, but that never really has a scene between Noctis and Luna, which I think it's really missing. So you did such a great job.
It did in flashbacks.
Yeah, a little bit, but not to the degree I think 9 has. 9 really gives, really makes me root for those characters, which I absolutely adore. So speaking of those characters, since you basically touch on everyone in this book with plenty of jabs at Quina, which are very much deserved, who is your favorite character in Final Fantasy 9?
Is it not obvious it's Quina? No, I'm joking. At risk of being a kind of cop-out answer, I've got to say it's Zidane, or however you pronounce that. It's always going to be Zidane to me. Before any voiced Final Fantasy work came out, it was always Zidane to me. I just like how he's such a good inverse of the typical Final Fantasy protagonist, that led up to 9. You look at Cloud, you look at Squall, and you've got quite reserved, moody characters, specifically with, Squall and Cloud, that actively push people away and keep them at a distance. And then with Zidane, you have this happy-go-lucky dude who's doing the opposite. He's reaching out to people. He loves expressing himself and making sure everyone's okay and taking care of his team and expanding that team. But, underneath all of that, you've got this massive personal issues. Identity is a huge theme in Final Fantasy IX. I don't think it's exactly groundbreaking to say that. But, more specifically with Zidane, it's this idea about where he comes from, about the genesis of his identity, a place to call home.
Nice. Yeah. And, really good theme reference there.
Yeah. And you see in Pandemonium when he gets all these answers to the questions that he's been pursuing all through the game and all through his life. And his character just unravels. And suddenly you have a direct comparison between the character he becomes. And Zidane he's pushing people away for their own good because he believes that he's going to bring bad things on the people around him. Wow, it is not easy coming up with the right words early in the morning.
That's okay. No, Zidane is my favorite character as well. He's very flirty. He's fun. I've always loved the little animations they have him do. Before he does something, he'll stretch out, he'll twist his body, and the way he taps on something with his big gloved hand. And thinking about him too from a gameplay perspective, it was so interesting having your thief, someone with the steal command, be your main character of the game. Usually that's reserved for Locke or, a more side character or someone who's not the main character in a game. So yeah, I've always really liked him a lot too. It's a really great cast, but I absolutely adore that character. So that's a great choice. So speaking of those characters, which one for you was the hardest to analyze?
My gut says Garnet. It wasn't so much difficulty in sort of cracking that shell. It's more the fact that within one character you have lots of different identities, and Garnet throughout the game is usually aware of each one. So she starts out as the little summoner girl that escapes Maiden Sari when it gets destroyed, and she arrives in Alexandria, and suddenly she's no longer Sarah, she's Princess Garnet, and she takes the place of this deceased child and lives an entirely different life. And as she gets older, she really steps into the role of princess, and she runs from Alexandria to try and prevent a war and to save her kingdom. She then ascends to the throne, she becomes Queen Garnet, and she goes through that phase of muteness because she is so crippled by, one, the tragedies that have happened to her, and, secondly, that constantly at odds with herself. She wants to be a decent member of the party. She's playing that white mage role. She's got that responsibility of using her eidolons and maintaining them and making sure that she does what is right and what is expected of her. The people that she's with and the situations she gets herself into are always kind of at odds with the role that she's trying to play. And I thought that was really interesting to go into, but trying to keep it broad so you're not going down every little avenue and sort of looking at every altercation. Keeping it neat was quite challenging.
Yeah.
A
lot of subtlety to that character, so you did a good job picking up on again, the stuff that they don't really outright say, you kind of have to interpret and dig underneath for.
Oh yeah, 100%. Like you mentioned earlier, a scene that you kind of forgot about was the conversation that Garnet and Zidane have in Maiden Sari on the boat under the Eidolon Wall. And like, while that is really a little moment, there is a lot going on there in terms of the development, their personal issues sort of resolving, and also the romance that's building. Like, there's a lot of stuff that is really subtly done, but on a subconscious level as a player, you still pick up on it, and you register it as an emotional beat, you register it as a development without it being thrown in your face.
Yeah.
So it was really fun to sort of focus on a moment like that and pick it apart and be like, this is why you feel these different things, and also this is the stuff you might not be registering. The Ibsen story, Ibsen and Colin, like that expresses a lot about Zidane as a character because of the role he chooses to sort of emulate with. You know, he's Colin and Garnet is Ibsen. It's just more evidence to suggest that this whole story is Garnet's story, and Zidane is he's the protagonist, but he's a witness to this story. He's helping the story along. He's a real player in it, but really, he's the Colin to Garnet's Ibsen. He's following because he wants to follow along.
Right. I think that's definitely true in Final Fantasy X with Tidus and Yuna. However, I have to disagree. I do think this is still Zidane's story, but you make a good argument for it in the book. So readers, you'll have to check it out. Also, want to give a shout out to you for doing a good job of analyzing like Amaranth. He was a character I never really cared much about. He's kind of a throwaway to me. One, because he just joins the game so late. It's near the end of Disc 2 by the time you finally joined your party. And it's been so long since I played it. I kind of just assumed like there really wasn't anything to him. But you do a good analysis showing, oh no, he does kind of have this, might is right mentality of like, he just cares about strength and power. And I'd totally forgotten about that section in Ibsen's castle when he gets injured and Zidane has to go back and help him. So good job with that. Cause before then I was just kind of like, who's this guy? Like, I don't care. I was like, oh, okay, maybe there is a little more to Amaranth.
And he represents power, like personal power, in a way that none of the rest of the party really do. Mm-hmm. So he's a good role for Zidane in a way because he loses in a fair fight. But in contrast, I use him in contrast to Sifratli, who we just don't really see in the story at all. He shows up to ruin Freya's day, and then he just buggers off before he's needed when Beatrix shows up and wrecks Clara.
Yeah.
Well, she doesn't. You know what I mean? The Alexandrian attack on Clara happens. The influence that Fratli has on Freya and like his leaving Messier in the first place was to gain personal power to protect the things that mattered. That rubs off on Freya, and she becomes single-minded and getting stronger and working towards a singular goal. And you see the altercation that Freya and Amaranth get into on first meeting. There's barely any words exchanged. They just recognize the strength of each other and square up to one another. So there's this element of power and this chain of influence that sort of stems from Fratli, even though he's not there. It's really interesting. And by the time it gets to Amaranth, it's really diluted, and it is just a case of might is right. The powerful dictate how the world is run, which is kind of interesting when you go back down the chain and you get to Fratli, and it's just like, no, I need to become powerful so I can contend with people like Beatrix and protect my kingdom.
Right. Great answer there. It's Final Fantasy. The music is, of course, so interwoven, arguably one of Uematsu's best scores. So many great pieces in here, so I was glad to see you had a section of the book that was dedicated to the music, and you gave a whole section of my personal favorite song, which is Not Alone or You're Not Alone. I mean, I'll never forget the first time I heard that, in the hallway, and it's the all is lost moment, everything's crumbling for Zidane, he doesn't want to be around anyone, and you're fighting these people, and it just starts with this great soft piano, and eventually just builds and builds, and the chorus comes in, the guitar, such a great song, so I was glad to see that got a section. What is a song that you wanted to put in here that you had to leave out? Place to Call Home is great. Gestures in the Moon is such a fun little piano piece. You do touch on Lost in Me. I won't lie, part of me was, I wish you touched on Bittersweet Memories, which plays at the end when, one of my favorite Final Fantasy moments ever when, she throws off the crown, the pendant falls off, and she jumps into his arm, and the score just, as he is sweeping her off her feet, the score sweeps them both off their feet. Oh, I'm like getting goosebumps just thinking about it. So what was a song that you wanted to write about, but you just had to leave out?
It would probably have to be Dali, the were a couple other contenders, but I really like the way that the music is handled to sort of orchestrate emotional response to that section of story. So you enter the village of Dali, and it's a nice, relaxing, homely piece. Like after the challenges in the ice cavern and the fight with the Black Waltz and everything, and Steiner almost pushing Zidane off a cliff. You walk into this town and it's like, hey, Garnet, you've got to start talking like a normal human being. You can't be using these and thous all the time. Viva's all like, oh, gee whiz, a windmill, let's go have a look-see. And then everything kind of gets dark in a way that happens before you register it as a player. Viva's captured and you realize, oh, that's not a good thing, but, it's just a couple of kids that captured him, it's fine. Yeah. But then you discover the underground factory under the village, and the music cuts out and it gets really quiet, and as it's a game with no vocal cues, like you're intent on reading the information. You want to know what's going on, and while you're reading this dialogue and sort of going into this subterranean area, the music builds back up again in a really sinister way, and in the space of just a couple of minutes, you've gone from this really like chilled, colorful atmosphere to this dark underground facility with the sinister music playing in the background, and Vivi, as I said, he was like, oh wow, look, a windmill, that's amazing. Mm-hmm. Oh, chocobos, that's cool. To suddenly, oh my god, they're making murder dolls here. Am I a puppet? What is real? It's the transition using the music alone is really quite impressive, for a game that sort of predated the audio input.
Yeah.
From Final Fantasy X onwards.
Yeah, great choice. So this is going to be the last question I ask you. Was there anything that you wanted to put in that you had to cut, or maybe that you never even put in the first place, but you did? If 10 years from now we get the super chocolatey fudge edition of this book with the DLC, what's going to be in there that readers can't get right now?
Oh, yeah, the traditional square package of 20 pages, $20. Exactly. Or for $40, you can get a steelbook case.
Yeah, a steelbook case to put this book into.
I think, there were a few things. It was more little expansions that I had to cut out. So I mentioned before, I had to make the section on nihilism and stuff really rudimentary, just so I don't overcrowd the book with philosophy theories. Mm-hmm. I did want to look at the game from a more structural standpoint and sort of apply some Campbellian theory to the way that it's structured in each act. But to be honest, that sort of thing is kind of too niche for what I was doing. It takes away from the focus away from the story and looks just at the technicalities that people like me who write and really find critiquing interesting might go for it. But I wasn't going to put it in there at the expense of something actually to do with Final Fantasy IX. I would have done a little bit more on Amarant and Quina as well. Quina just gets, as you say, the jabs every now and again, and I think I just summed up my opinion. It's like, I like Quina. She is definitely an unkillable monster. Nothing's ever going to put Quina down. She's going to get those good eats, and that's the end of it. Yeah, I'd just say that's it. Just a few sections that didn't come to fruition purely for space reasons.
Well, in 2031, folks, look for the steelbook chocolate edition of this book to come out. Jamie, thank you so much for being on here with me. I've had a great time talking with you, folks. I can say personally, as someone who loves 9, it's a really quick read. It's not expensive, won't break the bank. If you care about 9 at all, do yourself a favor, pick this book up. You won't regret it. I will put a link to where you can purchase it in the description below. Jamie, is there any place people can follow you or a website you would want them to know about?
Sure. I am ejectsmearts on Facebook and Twitter, and I have a blog that's updated every month or so with just stuff that's going on. I have a portfolio for sort of writing samples of whatever project I'm working on. That's www.ejectsme.wordpress.com, and I'm sure Travis will put the links to all of that in the description for you if you are interested.
Awesome. No, that's great. Thanks so much, folks. I hope you've enjoyed this. Again, can't recommend it enough. Pick this book up, open your mind, open your ears to the melodies of life. We'll see you next time.